She opened her door to a freezing stranger, never imagining that a single act of kindness would bring the most feared family in the city to her doorstep the very next day. The rain didn't just fall, it attacked. Each drop was a tiny, cold fist hammering against the aging windows of Ilara's row house. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the old Italian-American neighborhood, a mournful sound that seemed to seep through the very bricks. Inside, Ilara sat wrapped in a threadbare quilt, listening to the symphony of her home's decay. The drip from the ceiling into the bucket in the corner of the living room was the steady percussion, the rattling window frames, the cymbals, the groaning pipes, the bass. She was 72 years old, a retired nurse whose savings had been devoured by her late husband's illness, leaving her with little more than memories and a house that was slowly surrendering to gravity and time. The evening news flickered on the small television, talking about a sudden, vicious cold snap. But Ilara didn't need a weatherman to tell her the world outside was unforgiving. She could feel it in her bones, a deep, persistent chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of loneliness, of being forgotten in a world that spun faster every year. That's when she heard it, a sound so faint it was almost stolen by the wind, a soft, hesitant tapping at her front door. It wasn't the confident knock of a neighbor or the crisp rap of a delivery person. It was a sound of desperation. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her solitude. In this neighborhood, you didn't open your door after dark for a sound like that. You turned off the lights, held your breath, and prayed it would go away. Every instinct, honed by years of city living and cautionary tales, whispered over backyard fences, screamed at her to stay put. It could be anyone.
A junkie, a thief, someone looking for a moment of weakness. And she was weak. Old, alone, with nothing but a deadbolt between her and the storm. The tapping came again, a little more urgent this time, followed by what sounded like a child's whimper, almost swallowed by the gale. That sound, it changed everything. It cut through her fear, finding the part of her that had spent 40 years cradling newborns and holding the hands of the dying. It was the sound of a child in need.
She clutched the quilt tighter, her knuckles white. The logical part of her brain was at war with the heart of a nurse, the soul of a mother. To open that door was to invite the unknown, the dangerous, the chaos of the world into her fragile sanctuary. To keep it closed was to become the very thing she feared the world had become. Cold, deaf, and unforgiving. She rose slowly, her joints aching in protest, and shuffled toward the door, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. What would you do? Would you turn that lock? Comment below. Would you open that door? Her hand trembled as she reached for the deadbolt. The metal was icy to the touch, a final cold warning. She took a deep, shaky breath, the scent of rain and damp plaster filling her lungs, and she turned the lock. The click was unnaturally loud in the quiet house, a sound of finality. She pulled the heavy wooden door inward, just a crack at first, peering into the maelstrom. The wind tore at the opening, trying to rip the door from her grasp, and there, huddled on her small concrete stoop, was the source of the knock. A man, his face gaunt and pale, in the sickly yellow glow of the porch light, his thin jacket soaked through and clinging to his frame. Beside him, a woman held a small child, a little girl no older than 5, wrapped in a thin, damp blanket. The child's face was buried in her mother's shoulder, her tiny body shivering uncontrollably. They weren't menacing, they weren't dangerous, they were drowning. The man's eyes met hers. They were dark, filled with a desperate plea but also a profound, weary dignity. There was no aggression in them, only exhaustion and fear for his family. He didn't speak right away, as if the words themselves were too heavy to lift. He just stood there, letting the sight of his shivering wife and child make his case. "Please," he finally whispered, his voice raspy and broken. "Just for a little while.
Until the storm passes. My car, it broke down a few blocks away. We have nowhere to go, please. Ilara looked past him, into the swirling darkness of the street. It was empty. There were no flashing lights, no signs of a broken-down car. A new wave of doubt washed over her. Was this a trick? A story to get inside? But then she looked at the little girl. The child lifted her head, and her wide brown eyes, glistening with unshed tears, locked onto Ilara's.
In that instant, all the what-ifs, all the fears of a lonely old woman evaporated. This wasn't a problem to be solved or a threat to be assessed. It was a child, freezing in a storm. She pulled the door open wide. "Get in," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "All of you, get in now, out of that cold." The man's shoulders sagged with a relief so palpable it was almost a physical force. He nodded, a silent, profound thank you, and gently guided his wife and daughter over the threshold into the dim, meager warmth of Ilara's home. As they stepped onto her worn linoleum floor, leaving puddles of rainwater behind, the house suddenly felt different. It was no longer just her sanctuary, it was theirs. And with that realization, a terrifying question bloomed in her mind. Who had she just let into her life? The small house was filled with the sounds of their shivering. The man, who introduced himself quietly as Marco, helped his wife, Elena, unwrap the soaked blanket from their daughter, Sofia. The little girl's lips were tinted blue, her teeth chattering like tiny castanets. The nurse in Ilara took over immediately, her own fears pushed aside by the urgency of the situation. "Get those wet things off," she commanded gently, her voice slipping into the calm, authoritative tone she'd used for decades in hospital wards. She grabbed the quilt from her chair and wrapped it around Sofia, pulling the child into a firm, warming hug. Sofia burrowed into her, a small, cold creature, seeking life. Ilara's heart ached. She bustled around her tiny kitchen, her movements sure and practiced. She didn't have much, but she had a can of chicken noodle soup and half a loaf of bread. It was her dinner for the next 2 days, but that didn't matter now. She lit the gas stove, the familiar whoosh of the flame, a comforting sound against the raging storm. As the soup heated, the simple aroma of broth and herbs began to fill the small space, a scent of home, of safety. Marco and Elena stood awkwardly in the center of the room, looking utterly lost. They were ghosts in her home, specters of some unseen tragedy. They shed their wet jackets, revealing clothes that were worn but clean. They carried themselves with a quiet grace that seemed at odds with their desperate circumstances. There were no track marks on their arms, no slurring in their speech. They were just broken. "Please," Ilara said, gesturing to her small kitchen table. "Sit." They obeyed silently. She brought over 3 steaming bowls of soup and tore the bread into thick chunks. She watched them eat. Sofia, wrapped in the quilt, devoured her portion with the ravenous hunger of a child who had been cold for too long. Elena ate slowly, her eyes never leaving her daughter's face. Marco ate last, his gaze fixed on his bowl, as if ashamed of his own need. There were no questions asked. Ilara didn't press them for details about the car, or where they were from, or where they were going. The story was etched onto their faces, in the hollows under their eyes, and the tension in their shoulders. It was a story of loss. She recognized it because she lived with her own version of it every day. For the first time in years, her house didn't feel so empty. The silence wasn't one of loneliness, but of shared, unspoken understanding. These strangers, with their quiet sorrow, had filled the space her own grief had carved out. But as she watched Marco, she noticed something. The way he sat, straight-backed, even in his exhaustion. The way his eyes constantly scanned the room, the windows, the door. It wasn't the posture of a simple man down on his luck. It was the posture of a man who was hiding, a man who was watching for a threat far worse than the storm outside. As the night deepened, the storm began to relent, its fury softening into a steady, percussive rhythm on the roof. The warmth of the small house combined with the hot soup had worked its magic on little Sophia. Her shivering had stopped, and her eyelids grew heavy. She was asleep in her mother's arms, her breathing soft and even. Ilara knew she couldn't send them back out into the night. The temperature was still dropping, and even without the rain, the cold was dangerous. "You'll stay the night," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Elena looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "We couldn't possibly impose," she began, her voice soft as a whisper. Ilara waved her protest away. "Nonsense. I have one bed. You three will take it. I'll be fine here in my chair." Marco opened his mouth to object, but Ilara shot him a look that had silenced doctors and interns for 40 years. He closed it. For the first time that night, a flicker of something, a ghost of a smile, touched his lips. He simply nodded. Ilara led them to her small, tidy bedroom. It was sparse, decorated only with a faded photograph of her and her husband Samuel on their wedding day. She pulled back the covers on the bed, the sheets clean and smelling faintly of lavender. Elena carefully laid Sophia down, tucking her in with a tenderness that made Ilara's chest ache with a forgotten maternal instinct. Ilara left them, closing the door softly behind her, giving them the illusion of privacy in her tiny home. She settled back into her armchair, pulling a thin afghan over her legs. The house was quiet again, but this was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of a house holding its breath, filled with the presence of sleeping strangers. She couldn't sleep. Her mind raced, replaying the night's events, the knock, the fear, the child's eyes. She thought about the man, Marco. There was a hardness in him, a core of steel beneath the exhaustion. He was a protector. But what was he protecting his family from? As she sat there in the dim light, watching the shadows dance on the walls, she noticed something on the floor near where he had left his damp jacket. It was a small, wooden cross on a simple leather cord, the kind of thing someone would wear their entire life. It must have fallen when he took off his coat. She picked it up. The wood was worn smooth, polished by years of contact with skin. It was a symbol of faith, of hope. But holding it, Ilara felt a strange premonition. It felt less like an emblem of peace and more like a talisman against some encroaching darkness. Who were these people who carried their faith like a shield and their secrets like a shroud? Dawn broke grey and muted, the light filtering weakly through the rain-streaked windows. Ilara awoke with a crick in her neck, the afghan pooled at her feet. For a moment, she was disoriented, thinking she had dreamed the whole thing, but the empty soup bowls on the table and the damp jacket still hanging over the back of a chair confirmed it was real. The house was silent, too silent. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. She pushed herself up from the chair and moved quietly toward the bedroom. She tapped lightly on the door. "Hello?" she called softly. No answer. She tapped again, a little louder. "Are you awake in there?" Still nothing. Hesitantly, she turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was empty. The bed was made, the sheets pulled taut, and the pillows fluffed with a precision that was almost military. It was neater than she had left it. They were gone. It was as if they had been apparitions, a dream conjured by the storm. She walked into the room, a strange mix of relief and an emotion she couldn't quite name. Disappointment coursing through her. They had left without a word, without a goodbye. Maybe her instincts had been wrong. Maybe they were just gone. Then she saw it. On the small nightstand, next to the faded photograph of her and Samuel, was the neatly folded quilt she had given the little girl, and placed precisely in the center of it was a single, crisp $100 bill. Ilara stared at it. $100. To her, it was a fortune. It was groceries for 3 weeks. It was a payment toward the mountain of bills on her counter. Where could a family with nothing, who had claimed their car broke down, get a $100 bill? It made no sense. This wasn't the act of a desperate, penniless transient. This was a payment, a clean, final transaction. The gesture, meant to be one of gratitude, felt strangely cold. It felt like they were settling a debt, erasing their presence from her life as cleanly as they had made the bed. She picked up the bill. It was real, but as she held it, a deep unease settled over her. The mystery of the family hadn't vanished with them. It had only deepened. Who pays for a bowl of soup and a night on a floor with $100 and then vanishes like smoke? She stood there in the empty room, the money in her hand, feeling both like a blessing and a warning. The storm outside was over, but she had a sinking feeling that the one she had invited into her house was just beginning. Ilara spent the morning in a fog of confusion. She deposited the $100 at the local bank. The teller, giving her a curious look, she chose to ignore. The money felt heavy in her account, like a secret she was forced to keep. The day was unnervingly bright, the sky scrubbed clean by the storm. Puddles on the broken sidewalk shimmered, reflecting the freshly washed brick of the row houses. Everything looked the same, but for Ilara the world felt tilted on its axis. The silence of her house, once a familiar companion, now felt watchful. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes made her jump. She kept glancing out the front window, half expecting to see the strange family huddled on her stoop again, half expecting something else entirely. She tried to go about her routine, washing the few dishes, tidying the already tidy rooms, but her mind kept replaying the events. The man's eyes, the child's shiver, the neatly folded blanket. It was a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Around noon, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Gable, sweeping her stoop with the furious energy of a woman whose primary business was everyone else's. Mrs. Gable's eyes were like little black cameras recording every movement on the street. "Quite a storm last night," Mrs. Gable called out, her voice sharp and probing. "I saw you had visitors." Ilara's heart skipped a beat. Of course, she had seen. "Just some folks whose car broke down," Ilara replied, trying to keep her tone casual. "They needed to get out of the rain for a bit." Mrs. Gable leaned on her broom, her eyes narrowing. "Funny, I didn't hear a tow truck come by this morning, and they left on foot before the sun was even up. In a hurry, they seemed." The neighbor's curiosity felt like an accusation. Ilara felt a sudden, fierce wave of protectiveness for the family she didn't even know. They had secrets, that much was clear, and she felt an unspoken duty to guard them. It was a strange loyalty to people she had known for less than 12 hours. "Well, I'm sure they had their reasons," Ilara said, a note of finality in her voice. She turned to go back inside, but Mrs. Gable wasn't finished. "You have to be careful these days, Ilara. Letting strangers in. This neighborhood, it's not what it used to be. There are elements moving in. People you don't want to be involved with." The warning hung in the air, thick with insinuation. Ilara knew what she meant. For generations, the neighborhood had been run by a quiet, unseen code. Old families, old loyalties. Now new threats were emerging. Gangs from other parts of the city, preying on the elderly and the vulnerable. A chill ran down Ilara's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. Had she put a target on her own back? By showing a moment of kindness, had she marked herself as an easy victim in a world far more dangerous than she understood? The rest of the day passed in a state of suspended animation. Ilara tried to read, but the words swam before her eyes. She tried to watch television, but the cheerful chatter of the game show hosts felt alien and intrusive. The $100 bill was a constant nagging thought. It was a loose thread, and she feared that pulling on it would unravel something terrible. By late afternoon, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The neighborhood was settling into its evening rhythm, the sound of cars returning from work, the distant shouts of children playing street hockey. It was all so normal, so routine, that Ilara almost convinced herself she had imagined the entire night. She was just a lonely old woman whose mind was playing tricks on her. Then she saw them. At first, it was just one, a long black sedan, the kind you only see in movies, with windows so darkly tinted you couldn't see inside. It turned onto her street slowly, deliberately, its polished chrome gleaming in the fading light. It was utterly out of place among the dented minivans and aging pickup trucks. Then a second one appeared behind it, and a third. They moved in a silent, predatory procession, crawling down the narrow street like panthers stalking their prey. They pulled to a stop directly in front of her house, perfectly spaced, engines humming with a low, powerful thrum. Doors opened in unison. Men in dark, impeccably tailored suits emerged. They were not police. They were not government agents. They were something else. Something older and more formidable. They moved with a quiet confidence, an unnerving stillness that commanded the entire street. Neighbors who had been sitting on their stoops suddenly found urgent reasons to go inside. Curtains twitched. The sound of children playing abruptly ceased. A profound, heavy silence fell over the block, broken only by the low hum of the idling engines. Elara stood frozen in her living room, her hand pressed to her chest, her breath caught in her throat. This was it. Mrs. Gable's warning echoed in her ears. She had done something wrong. She had gotten involved with the wrong people. The family she had helped. They weren't just in trouble. They were trouble. Her act of compassion was about to bring ruin to her doorstep. Her legs felt weak, her mind a whirlwind of terror. Who were they coming for? Her? The strangers from last night? A sharp, authoritative knock echoed from her front door, and Elara knew she had no choice but to answer. The world she had invited in was no longer a mystery. It was here. Elara walked to the door as if in a dream, her feet heavy, her ears ringing. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to pretend she wasn't home, but she knew it was pointless. These were not men who would be deterred by an unanswered door. She opened it, her hand shaking so badly she could barely grip the knob. Standing on her stoop was not a thug or a hitman from some gangster film. It was an old man, likely in his late 70s, with a full head of silver hair swept back from a deeply lined forehead. He wore a beautiful dark wool overcoat, perfectly tailored, and leaned lightly on a cane with a polished silver head. His face was a roadmap of a long and complicated life, but his eyes were what held her. They were a startlingly clear shade of blue, sharp and intelligent, and they regarded her not with menace, but with a profound, almost solemn respect. Behind him, on the sidewalk, the other men stood at attention, their faces impassive, their gazes fixed forward. They were soldiers, and he was their general. "Mrs. Elara Harris?" he asked. His voice was raspy with age, yet it carried an undeniable weight of authority. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. Elara could only nod, her own voice having abandoned her. He gave a small, courteous dip of his head. "My name is Antonio Costello. May I have a moment of your time? It is a matter of great importance." The name Costello resonated deep in the neighborhood's memory. It was a name whispered with a mixture of fear and reverence. The Costello family had been a silent power in this part of the city for generations. They weren't flashy gangsters, they were the old guard, a network that operated on codes of honor and loyalty that were all but extinct in the modern world. They were, for all intents and purposes, the Mafia, but the man before her didn't fit the caricature. He looked like someone's grandfather, a patriarch from a bygone era. I don't understand," Elara stammered, finding her voice at last. "What is this about?" Mr. Costello's gaze was direct, unwavering. "It is about my son," he said softly, "and my granddaughter. You gave them shelter from the storm last night." The world seemed to tilt and then slam back into place. Marco, Sophia. This man, this powerful, feared man, was their father, their grandfather. The shivering family on her doorstep was not just a family. They were the family. They needed help," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "It was nothing." Mr. Costello's expression softened, a flicker of genuine warmth in his ancient eyes. "To you, perhaps, it was nothing," he said, his voice imbued with a deep, resonant gravity. "To my family, Mrs. Harris, it was everything. You offered sanctuary to my blood when they were at their most vulnerable. That is a debt that can never be repaid with something as simple as money." He gestured behind him, and Ilara realized she had been so focused on him that she hadn't truly seen the other men. They weren't just bodyguards, they were carrying tools. Ilara was speechless. She simply stood in her doorway, a fragile old woman in a faded house dress, as the patriarch of the Costello family explained. His words were calm, measured, but they painted a picture of a world she could barely comprehend. He spoke of a family business matter, a betrayal from within that had forced his son, Marco, to flee with his family for a single, desperate night. They had been cut off, exposed, with no resources but the clothes on their backs. "My son is a proud man," Don Costello said, his eyes filled with a father's complex mix of pain and admiration. He would not risk leading trouble to the doors of his friends. So he walked. He walked until he saw a light on in a window, in a house that felt safe. "He chose your door, Mrs. Harris, because he saw the light of a good soul." Ilara thought of her flickering lamp, a beacon against the storm, and a shiver ran through her. To think that such a small, insignificant thing could have such profound consequences. "The $100 he left," the old man continued, a hint of apology in his tone, "was all he had that he could not have traced back to him. It was an insult to your kindness, but it was the only gesture he could make without endangering you further. Please, forgive his desperation." He then gestured to the men who stood waiting patiently on the sidewalk. "A debt of honor has been incurred. Our family does not take such debts lightly. You did not just give my family shelter, you reminded us of the kindness that still exists in this world. And so, we will repay that kindness not with cash, which is meaningless, but with what we have, with our hands, with our protection." He took a small step forward, his gaze sweeping over her small, crumbling house. He saw the peeling paint, the cracked concrete of the stoop, the slight sag in the roofline that she tried so hard to ignore. "You have protected what is most precious to me," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Now, it is our turn to protect what is precious to you. This home, your peace, your security." Before Ilara could process what was happening, the men moved with quiet, disciplined efficiency. They weren't thugs casing the joint, they were craftsmen assessing a job. One man, burly with hands like worn leather, walked to the side of the house and looked up at the roof, his expert eye immediately spotting the source of her leak. Another produced a sophisticated-looking toolkit and began examining the frayed wiring leading to her porch light. A third knelt to inspect a crack in the foundation. It was surreal. The most feared men in the city were not here to threaten her. They were here to fix her gutters. She had opened her door to a family in need, and in return, an entire organization, a hidden kingdom with its own code of ethics, had arrived to become her guardian angels. The arrival of the Costello family's men was like the start of a silent, efficient invasion of goodwill. Ilara watched, dazed, from her living room window as her small, neglected property was transformed into a hive of activity. One man, with the weathered face of a stonemason, began meticulously examining the crumbling mortar between the bricks of her facade. Two others, younger but just as serious, unloaded lumber and shingles from a pristine, unmarked van. They moved with a purpose that was both unnerving and deeply reassuring. There were no loud shouts, no blaring radios, just the quiet, professional sounds of work. The scrape of a trowel, the hum of a power drill, the soft thud of a hammer. Don Costello had taken a seat in one of her kitchen chairs, which one of his men had insisted on wiping down first. He sipped the instant coffee she had nervously offered him as if it were the finest espresso. "My son Marco," he said, breaking the silence. "He is a good man, headstrong. He takes after his mother. He wanted to handle the situation himself, to protect me. But a father always knows when his children are in trouble. Ilara sat across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. He seemed very worried, she said, the understatement of the century. He was, the Don confirmed with a solemn nod. The world we live in, Mrs. Harris, it has rules. When those rules are broken, there is chaos. Last night was chaos. You were the calm in that chaos. You were the order. He spoke of loyalty and betrayal, of family and honor, in a way that made them seem like tangible things, like the bricks and mortar his men were now repairing. He wasn't glorifying his life, he was simply explaining its principles. To him, the world was divided not into legal and illegal, but into the honorable and the dishonorable. By sheltering his family without question, Ilara had performed an act of profound honor. And in his world, honor was a currency more valuable than gold. My granddaughter Sophia, he said, a genuine smile finally lighting up his stern features. She told me about the angel lady who gave her hot soup and a warm blanket. She has not stopped talking about you. A lump formed in Ilara's throat. The fearsome Don Costello was, at his core, just a grandfather doting on his grandchild. This simple, humanizing detail broke through the last of her fear, replacing it with a bewildering sense of connection. Outside, the work continued. By nightfall, her porch light was no longer flickering, but shone with a bright, steady glow. A new, sturdy-looking lock had been installed on her front door. It was just the beginning, but it was more than she could have ever dreamed of. She had spent years feeling invisible. Now she was under the watchful eye of a king in his own kingdom, and his entire army was dedicated to rebuilding her castle, one brick at a time. The transformation of Ilara's house became the talk of the neighborhood. Over the next few days, the black cars were a constant, quiet presence on the street. The men worked from dawn until dusk. They were meticulous, their craftsmanship a testament to an old-world pride that was rarely seen anymore. They didn't just patch the leaky roof, they replaced the entire thing with new, high-quality shingles. They didn't just fix the drafty windows, they installed new, double-paned ones that sealed out the winter cold. They rewired the faulty electrical system, plastered the cracks in her walls, and even replanted the withered rose bushes in her small front yard. Mrs. Gable watched from her window, her perpetual scowl replaced by an expression of slack-jawed astonishment. The other neighbors, who had once kept their distance from the lonely old woman, now offered hesitant, respectful nods when they saw her. Her status had changed overnight. She was no longer just Ilara Harris, the widow. She was the woman the Costellos were taking care of. She was protected. The fear that had once been associated with that name was subtly morphing into a kind of grudging respect on the block. The Costellos weren't harassing anyone. They weren't making a scene. They were simply helping. They were tending to one of their own. One afternoon, Marco and his family returned. This time, they didn't come in the dead of night, shivering and desperate. They arrived in one of the black sedans, looking rested and whole again. Sophia ran to Ilara the moment she saw her, wrapping her tiny arms around her legs. "Angel lady!" she cried, her voice full of pure, childish joy. Elena embraced her next, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. "We can never thank you enough," she whispered. Marco stood back, his hands in his pockets, but the look on his face was one of profound, heartfelt debt. "My father explained," he said, his voice low and steady. "Our family's honor is now tied to your well-being."
You are safe. It was more than a promise. It was a decree. The words settled over Ilara like the warmest, safest blanket. For the first time since her husband Samuel had passed, she didn't feel alone. She had inadvertently stumbled into a family, a clan bound by codes she was only just beginning to understand. But as the physical repairs to her home neared completion, she would soon discover that the Costello family's definition of repayment went far beyond wood and nails.
It went to the very heart of the struggles that had been crushing her for years. With her home physically secure, Ilara began to breathe a little easier. The constant worry about the roof caving in or the wiring sparking a fire had vanished. But other, more insidious worries remained. Piled on her kitchen counter was a stack of letters, each one a reminder of the debt that Samuel's long illness had left behind. Hospital bills, collection notices, threats of legal action. It was a mountain of paper that represented a crushing weight on her soul. She had been paying what little she could each month, a futile gesture like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. One evening, Don Costello visited again, this time alone. He came not as a powerful patriarch, but as a friend stopping by for a chat. He sat at her kitchen table, refusing her offer of coffee, and simply looked at her. His ancient, perceptive eyes seemed to see everything. "The house is strong now," he said, "but the foundation of a person's peace is not just in their home. It is in their mind." He gestured gently toward the stack of bills. "Forgive an old man's prying eyes," he said, his tone devoid of judgment, "but I see you carry a burden that new shingles cannot fix." Ilara felt a flush of shame, as if her private struggles had been laid bare. It's from my husband's care," she stammered. "I'm managing." The old Don held up a hand. "Managing is not living," he said softly. "Samuel was a good man, worked at the docks for 40 years. He was respected. It is a disgrace of this modern world that a man works his entire life, and his reward is to leave his widow in debt to institutions with no soul." He fell silent for a long moment, staring at the pile of envelopes. "My family," he said finally. "We believe debts should be paid, but we also believe in justice. Some debts are unjust." He rose from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate. "Allow me to make an inquiry on your behalf," he said. It was not a question. It is a simple matter of paperwork. Sometimes paperwork gets lost. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You rest, Mrs. Harris. You have carried this weight long enough." He left as quietly as he had come. Ilara didn't know what he meant, what he could possibly do. The next day, her phone rang. It was a prim-sounding woman from the hospital's billing department. "Mrs. Harris?" the woman said, her voice clipped and professional. "We're calling to inform you that an anonymous donation has been made to the hospital's benevolent fund in your late husband's name. As a result, your outstanding balance has been resolved in full." Ilara nearly dropped the phone. Resolved. A single word that lifted a decade of weight from her shoulders. It wasn't just paid, it was erased, as if it had never existed. She knew with absolute certainty whose quiet inquiry had caused this miraculous paperwork to get lost. The Costellos didn't just fix homes, they fixed lives, and they were not done yet. The erasure of her medical debt felt like a miracle, a fundamental shift in her reality. For years, every purchase, every decision had been overshadowed by that crippling sum. Now, it was gone, but Ilara's newfound peace was short-lived. There was one more dragon left to slay, one that was far more personal and persistent. Her landlord, Mr. Henderson. Ilara only owned her unit. Henderson owned the building and the land it sat on. He was a vulture in a cheap suit, a man who saw the historic neighborhood not as a community, but as a future luxury condo development. For the past year, he had been trying to drive out the remaining long-term tenants with a campaign of harassment and neglect, inventing fees, ignoring repair requests, and sending threatening letters. Her home might be newly renovated, but she knew it was only a matter of time before Henderson found a new way to try and force her out. A week after the hospital debt vanished, he appeared. He banged on her new front door, his knock loud and arrogant. When Ilara opened it, he shoved a piece of paper into her hand. "Eviction notice," he sneered, his eyes flicking with disdain over the new windows and pristine brickwork. "Violation of lease terms, unauthorized alterations to the property, You have 30 days. Ilara's blood ran cold. But I didn't authorize these, she said, her voice trembling. They were a gift. Henderson laughed, a nasty, grating sound. A gift? From who? The construction fairy? I don't care. It's my building and you're out. I've wanted you gone for months. This just gives me the perfect excuse. He puffed out his chest, enjoying her fear. He was a small man who derived his power from making others feel smaller. He was so engrossed in his petty tyranny that he didn't notice the black sedan that had pulled up silently to the curb. He didn't see the passenger door open. He didn't notice the figure that emerged until a calm, raspy voice cut through the air. Is there a problem here? Don Antonio Costello stood on the sidewalk, his silver-headed cane planted firmly on the pavement. He was not looking at Henderson with anger or threat. It was something far more chilling. He was looking at him with utter disinterest, as if Henderson were a piece of grime to be wiped away. Henderson's smug expression faltered. He recognized the old man as everyone in the neighborhood did. This is a private matter, he blustered, trying to reclaim his authority. Between a landlord and his tenant. The Don took a slow step forward, his gaze never leaving Henderson's face. I believe you are mistaken, he said, his voice as cold and smooth as Riverstone. You are not her landlord, for you see, as of this morning, you no longer own this building. Mr. Henderson stared at the old man, his face a comical mask of disbelief and confusion. What are you talking about? Of course I own this building.
I have the deed, the title. His blustering trailed off as Don Costello simply smiled, a thin, knowing smile that didn't reach his eyes. Deeds can be bought, titles can be transferred, the Don said calmly. I found your asking price to be persuasive. My associates concluded the transaction this morning. You are trespassing on my property. He let the words hang in the air, each one a hammer blow to Henderson's pathetic arrogance.
The landlord's face paled, the ruddy color draining away to a pasty white. He looked from the Don to Ilara and back again, the reality of the situation finally dawning on him. He hadn't been dealing with a helpless old woman. He had been harassing a protected member of the most powerful family in the city. The eviction notice fluttered from his nerveless fingers and landed on the newly repaired stoop. Don Costello didn't even glance at it. He pulled a folded document from the inside pocket of his overcoat. This, however, he said, holding it out to Ilara, is for you. Ilara took it with a trembling hand. It was a deed, a legal, official property deed, with her name, Ilara Harris, listed as the sole owner of her home, free and clear, no mortgage, no landlord, just hers. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the crisp black ink. I can't accept this, she whispered, the sheer magnitude of the gift overwhelming her. I could never repay you. The Don reached out and gently patted her hand, his touch surprisingly warm. Mrs. Harris, he said, his voice softening with genuine affection. You already have. You repaid it with a bowl of soup on a stormy night. You repaid it when you opened your door to a freezing child without asking for anything in return. He turned his gaze back to the now trembling Henderson. Now I suggest you leave, he said, his voice once again hard as steel.
And never show your face in this neighborhood again. Henderson didn't need to be told twice. He practically scrambled off the property, stumbling back to his car and speeding away without a backward glance. Ilara stood on her stoop, clutching the deed to her chest. It was more than paper. It was freedom. It was peace. It was a future she no longer had to fear.
An act of simple human decency had been returned to her 1,000-fold, not with a bag of money, but with the one thing she had craved most, a permanent, unshakable sanctuary. She was, finally, home. In the weeks that followed, Ilara's life settled into a new and beautiful rhythm. The silence in her house was no longer the sound of loneliness, but of peace. The drip from the ceiling was replaced by the gentle ticking of a new clock on her mantelpiece, a housewarming gift from Elena and Marco. Her days were not empty anymore. On Tuesdays, Elena would come by with Sophia, and they would bake cookies in Ilara's small, warm kitchen, filling the house with the scent of sugar and cinnamon. Sophia, now bright-eyed and confident, would call her Grandma Ilara and draw her colourful pictures of angels with curly grey hair. On Saturdays, Marco would stop by, never staying long, but always with a bag of fresh groceries from the market, or just to check if she needed anything. He rarely spoke of his family business, but the quiet respect in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. She was one of them now. She was family. The neighborhood had changed too. The atmosphere of fear that had been creeping in was gone, replaced by a renewed sense of community. The Costellos' protection extended invisibly over the entire block. The petty crime ceased. The graffiti disappeared. People started sitting on their stoops again in the evenings, talking to one another. Even Mrs. Gable offered Ilara a genuine, warm smile one morning. Don Costello would visit occasionally, sitting with her at her kitchen table. They would talk for hours, not about crime or business, but about life, about growing old, about the importance of holding on to the old ways in a world that was forgetting them. He told her stories of his wife, long past, and she told him stories of Samuel. They were just two old souls from vastly different worlds who had found a common ground in the language of loyalty and family. One Sunday afternoon, the entire Costello clan descended on her small house for dinner. The place was filled with laughter, the rich aroma of Elena's lasagna, and the happy shouts of children. Ilara sat at the head of the table, a place of honor, with Don Costello beside her. As she looked around at the faces, at Marco, Eleanor, Sophia, and all the others who now called her family, she realized the true nature of the repayment. They hadn't just fixed her house, they had rebuilt her life. They had filled the empty spaces, chased away the shadows, and given her a purpose again. She had opened her door to one family in the storm, and in return a much larger one had opened its heart to her, proving that the strongest bonds are not forged in blood, but in the quiet, profound moments of kindness that shine like a light in the dark. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Stories like Ilara's remind us that a single act of compassion can ripple outwards in ways we can never predict. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment of kindness from a stranger that changed everything? Share your story in the comments below. We read every single one. And if you believe in the power of human connection and want more heartfelt stories that explore the hidden codes of honor that bind us together, please subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. Your support allows us to keep telling stories that matter